What up, reading room? We said, Lucy's like, what? We started early. Yeah, pretty early. My clock was off. The electricity went out last night for like only a couple minutes, but it did. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. We are here in the classroom. It is day 213. Takes her a minute to get used to the yelling. It did for us kids too. In the classroom. And it is July 1st. Thanks so much for joining me here. Let's take a look at the beautiful flowers that I have there. Thank you to my family who gave those to me. And let's go ahead and continue with our book, which is, I think we're going to leave it like that today. That looks so nice, doesn't it? It does. Okay. And so we are here on chapter 15. And if I'm not mistaken, oh my gosh, we're on our last chapter. I better find another book. So, and I'm going to read it all to, oh wait, no, no we're not. Nope. There is a chapter 16. I thought that there was. So let's get started. The Aboriginal World and Christian History. Chapter 15. Had the world been a three-story finite universe, the Christian doctrine of history might have maintained itself and been a valid consideration of modern people. The simple story of mankind growing out of the Garden of Eden and populating the world might have been sufficient for all men in their own times. The world did not remain as the early prophets conceived it. By 300 BC, Alexander the Great had shown the Near Eastern peoples the wonders of India. Explorations by Europeans over a 1,000-year period indicated that the globe was much larger than the writer of Genesis had figured. Columbus demonstrated that it was indeed a globe. The trauma of discovery of the New World for the Christian theologians was immense. It had not yet been adequately understood by them. What were devout thinkers to make of the existence of millions of people living on lands larger than Europe? What was their status with respect to Christianity, the one true religion? Did God have a purpose for these people? Could Jesus return until all these nations had been preached the gospel? What was the responsibility of God's chosen nations in the face of this revelation of the tremendous scope of mankind? Well said once again. Who are we? I've had so many authors lately. So Deloria. Well said, Vinnie Deloria Jr. The reaction of the Christian nations to the discovery of the New World and its potential riches was one of unmitigated greed. Having been repulsed by the Muslims in their efforts to subjugate the Near East and nearly prostrated after the wars to establish the divine right monarchies, the kings of Europe badly needed an inexhaustible source of income to maintain themselves. Visualizing a steady stream of wealth from the Indies, which would allow them to avoid giving benefits to the rising commercial classes in return for financial support to the crown, the heads of the European states saw in the New World the only hope of maintaining themselves. The Christian church was even more eager to exploit the new lands, its political power beginning to wane with the rise of strong European political leaders. The Christian church saw a means of directing the invasion of the new lands by placing its imprimatur on exploitation, in effect thus taking a percentage of the loot in return for blessing the enterprise. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued his Inter Caetera Bull, which laid down the basic Christian attitude toward the New World. Among other works well-pleasing to the divine majesty and cherished of our heart, this assuredly ranks highest, that in our times, especially the Catholic faith and the Christian religion, be exalted and everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. What this pious language meant in practical terms was that if confiscation of lands were couched in quasi-religious sentiments, the nations of Europe could proceed. In an immensely practical gesture, the Pope noted that he did thereby give, grant, and assign forever to you and your heirs and successors, King of Castile and Leon, all singular, the aforesaid countries and islands hitherto discovered and to be discovered, together with all their dominions, cities, camps, places, and villages, and all rights, jurisdictions, and appurtenances of the same. Well, I called it. That's what he said. I called it. That's the game the Pope is playing. I called it. Right? That's all I have to do. You might need your patents and your laws, but I called it, and that's the end. Didn't you get the asterisk? Don't you know what infallible means? The lands and villages were not, of course, the Pope's to give, unless the understanding of the universe, history, and the planet promulgated by Christianity were correct. If such were the case, then it would have followed that, the entire planet being a franchise of the Holy Father, he could distribute it to whomever he found in need of rewarding, regardless of the latter, totally secular exploitations of the native peoples conducted by the secular governments of Europe. This papal bull of 1493 marked the attitude of Christianity toward peoples it had not previously thought to exist. The controversy, I mean, that is just phenomenal. Now all of a sudden you have to make your narrative fit a people you didn't even realize existed. The controversy over the place of the newly discovered natives continued to rage, however, as more information on the New World was made available to the people of Europe. The Treaty of Tordesillas in the following year divided South America neatly between Spain and Portugal, allowing each primacy over portions of the continent which neither had explored or conquered. Plainly, the Pope was supervising not the divinely ordered division of the world's lands, but national hunting licenses for rape and pillage. The status of native peoples around the globe was firmly cemented by the intervention of Christianity into the political affairs of exploration and colonization. They were regarded as not having ownership of their lands, but as merely existing on them at the pleasure of the Christian God, who had now given them to the nation of Europe. Upon encountering a tribe or nation of native peoples, the Spanish used to read their requirement, which basically recited the Christian interpretation of history, beginning with the Garden of Eden and ending with the Pope, then enthroned in Rome. The natives were then asked to pledge their allegiance to the Pope and the King of Spain. Failing to surrender to Christianity, and expanding Spanish Empire meant that it was then legal and an act of religious piety for the Europeans to wage war to wrest the lands from the people. Wrest, W-R-E-S-T. Again, the use of Christian doctrines served to justify the actions of the Christian nations. For centuries, Christian theologians debated the conception of the nature of the just war in much the same manner as Protestant theologians used to debate the morality of killing people trying to get in your home bomb shelter during an atomic attack back in the days when America was paranoid over Russian missile attacks. The natives, refusing to accept the gospel, were thus made subjects of the just Christian war, since they had refused to accept the truth which had been revealed some 1,500 years before. As exploration and colonization continued, the debate expanded about the native peoples and their rights. The only available philosophical system purporting to explain the world of daily events was that of Aristotle, who had once divided mankind into men and slaves. The anti-Indian theologians relied heavily upon Aristotelian, as in Aristotle, Aristotelian thinking to support their thesis that natives could be enslaved. Even pro-native theologians admitted that the natives should be subjected to force until they were converted to the true faith. In 1526, Francisco de Vitoria al Salamanca attacked the use of Aristotle to deny Indians of the New World their rights to property and liberty. Vitoria denied the rights of the Christians to convert the natives forcibly, since he was aware of the mistreatment that had been the lot of the natives resisting conversion. But he then justified conquest of the natives of their lands on the basis of Christian trade rights, finding that God had intended all nations to trade with one another. Any nation or group that prevented trade could then be conquered so that uninhabited trade might continue. Sounds like today, doesn't it? Prevent what we did to Asia and Pacific Islands. Preventive conquest to protect commercial rights was then on the basis on which the Spanish and Portuguese made complete their mastery of the new lands and their peoples. By 1550, two camps of theologians had developed, each with its own version of the legal and theological status of the peoples of the New World. Each theory, incidentally, led to justifying the people's exploitation and conquest. Father Las Casas took the side of the natives, while Juan de Sepulveda took the opposing view and justified extinction and enslavement. Las Casas interpreted the Christian position and the 1493 Papal Bull as giving a right to Spain only to preach the Christian doctrine peaceably. The natives' existing property rights were to be recognized. Sepulveda, a rigorous Aristotelian philosopher, so Western thought, Western philosophy, simply classified the natives as among those who had been meant to be subjugated. Their opposition to Spanish enslavement was thus morally wrong, since it violated the purpose for which God had intended the natives. So here we have a survival of the fittest and a perversion of Darwinian theory. Their opposition to Spanish enslavement was thus morally wrong, since it violated the purpose for which God had intended the natives. For Sepulveda, pure Christian chauvinism was the answer to the problem of the old world meeting the new world. While he did not totally win the debate, his views were eagerly accepted by those Europeans going to the New World, thus winning his point, in fact, in what came after him. By the time that the other European nations got into the business of discovering lands and peoples in the Western Hemisphere, the struggle for recognition of native legal rights had, for all practical purposes, vanished. The European nations were more concerned with their wars for control of distant lands than they were in acknowledging the rights of the peoples over whom they asserted control. The doctrine that the Pope had been given total control over the planet by God was soon secularized into justification for European nations, definitively Christian, to conquer and subdue the peoples of the lands which they entered. Once the doctrine became secularized, it was impossible for anyone to question its validity. Its impact was obvious, and the results were satisfactory to European political heads of state. Gradually, then, the colonizing European powers began to define their rights with respect to other nations of non-Christian peoples. The natives had rights to occupy the lands on which they had traditionally lived until such time as those lands were needed by the invading Europeans. At that time, the European nation could extinguish the natives' title by purchase. Could extinguish a native's title by purchase or conquest. With respect to each other, the European nations respected the claims of the nation that first explored new lands and had sufficient military power to protect its claim. With respect to the natives who happened to occupy the lands, they were completely at the mercy of the claiming Christian nation. The wars for control of the North American continent saw the claims of the various European nations dwindle as England consistently defeated the other nations and succeeded to their claims as each gave up its territory on the continent as part of the peace terms. While European wars raged between England and France, Spain, Holland, and other countries, the natives' legal rights were bounced back and forth as concessions made in wars that had little to do with the people of the continent. You could totally see that, right? England had no sooner achieved dominance in North America than the English colonists revolted against the mother country. Aided by France, which was still smarting over the defeat handed them by England a decade before, they succeeded in freeing themselves from English control. Almost the first claim put forth by the new nation after the successful break with England was that the colonies had succeeded to the claims made by the mother country under the doctrine of discovery. The United States was therefore under no obligation to deal justly with the continent's interior tribes. Rather, it stood well within the tradition of Christian nations that had previously looted Central and South America and were then in the process of conquering India and Africa. The basic legal policy of the United States government became one of tentative recognition of the Indian interest in the land, combined with the assertion that the lands could be taken from the people at any time they were needed by the federal government. Sounds like the big lie they said of my house while they let it sit there and all my things deteriorate like SOBs, wondering if I'm going to go back over there illegally to get my property. The first articulation of the Christian attitude toward the native peoples and their rights came in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, in which the Congress of the United States proclaimed that it would never take the Indian lands except in just wars. As it turned out, there were no unjust wars, and the lands were systematically taken. After a century of conflict and systematic oppression, the tribes were lucky to survive with a fragment of their former homelands as reservations for those who had not been killed. The story is not simply that the American Indians, however, since the history of Christian nations around the globe has been less than religious. England and France fought titanic struggles for control of the Indian subcontinent, for parts of Africa, and for trade rights in North Africa and Asia. As late as the First World War, the nations of the planet were being given to dominant European nations as League of Nations mandates and protectorates, and colonialism has still not vanished. So there we are with the World War I treaties, the World War I excuse to remake the boundaries, and colonialism is there to this day. It now shows itself as the American political crusade against communism, or as the operational results of the giant supernatural corporations of Western peoples. When Canada and Australia achieved independence from the British Crown, they allegedly stepped into the shoes of the Queen insofar as the natives of the lands were concerned. The Queen had been the trustee for Indian lands in Canada, and a substantial portion of the Canadian lands had been held by the Queen on behalf of the native Indian tribes. After the British North American Act, Canada refused to accept its responsibilities with respect to native land rights. Today, the Trudeau government refuses to recognize the land titles of the Canadian Indian tribes, and thus even the veneer of protection about Aboriginal title has given to the natives of the United States has been denied to Canadian Indians. The Aborigines in Australia are in worse shape. Since they are by definition without rights, they cannot enter the courts of that land to defend their rights to lands on which they have lived for thousands of years. So they're 50 years behind us. Australia 100 years behind us. Australia simultaneously claims the legal right to the lands of the continent as derived from Great Britain, while denying the Australian Aborigines the right to demand from the Australian government the protection and land occupancy such a derived title implies. The South American countries make no bones about simply exterminating their Indians. Brazil has carried on systematic genocide against the interior native tribes for many years. The atrocities committed against these people have been well documented by numerous groups and promptly denied by Brazilian officials. Not the slightest pretense has been made that the natives could have any rights to land. They are simply moved or killed whenever land is needed by the Brazilian government. Well, good students. Almost all of the South American nations are predominantly Catholic and reflect the same attitude once promulgated by Sepulveda. So Catholics have this eugenics hierarchy attitude. So now we know how they connect to Nazi Germany and fascist movement. You just have to look at the belief system. That's all you have to do. Then you know where they align. You can call them whatever you want to call them. Change your name to neo-Nazis. Change your name to white supremacists. It doesn't really matter. Look at their belief system. So, interesting, Catholics. Some men are meant to be slaves, and it is immoral for them to resist enslavement. That is the Catholic attitude. You son of a bitches, you. Even smaller nations that should have lands and rights protected have been denied any voice in the matter. Sweden simply moved into Lapland some centuries ago and now denies the Lapps may have any rights in their land. In a situation similar to Canada, changes in Swedish national law and status have erased any mention of the rights and property that the Lapps may have had. At present, the Swedish government is busy finishing the cultural genocide of the Lapp or Sane people through the travesty of court procedures which have already been arranged to divest the Lapps or any rights to their lands and national status. The final arena of degradation is what is now known as the Trust Territories of the Pacific. Did I say that? During the period before the Second World War, Japan fortified those lands received as protectorates following the peace ending the First World War. As the Second World War got underway, the American forces invaded many of the islands Japan had occupied and many Japan had not occupied. Invaded. As the war progressed, a substantial number of peaceful islands got in the way of the two superpowers and were taken by one side or the other. The peaceful Pacific was soon divided between the United States and Japan. After the Japanese surrender, all the islands came under what may be euphemistically called a United States Trust. That is to say, the United States now holds the islands and will continue to do so until it feels like disposing of them. Little effort has been made to give the islands political freedom, and they are now being prepared for large excursions of affluent American tourists. The peaceful Pacific will shortly be America's vacation land, and its people will be servants to rich vacationing Americans. They will never receive even the degree of independence they enjoyed prior to the Second World War, even worse. So this is what Americanization means. They will never receive even the degree of independence they enjoyed prior to the Second World War. Even worse, their lives are administered by the Department of the Interior, a bureaucracy hopelessly inept and unconcerned. Oh, you mean feeble-minded. That's what you mean. Feeble-minded. By definition, you motherfuckers can't learn. The responsibility of Christianity for this state of affairs must certainly be heavy. Without the initial Christian doctrines giving Europeans free rein over the rest of the world, much of the exploitation would not have occurred. And you know what? For the Pope not to be able to understand the concept of infallibility or the evidence demonstrating no definition of infallibility also demonstrates feeble-mindedness. It was only when, and that whole sexcapade over there under Pope Benedict shows that you have predilection towards promiscuous sex despite your vows, which also shows immorality in your inability to be able to keep your word. And even to follow the guidelines of your job description. Your job description says you're infallible. That's what it says. I think you stay out of the limelight because you're afraid every instance you're in the limelight demonstrates you are fallible. The responsibility of Christianity for the state of affairs must certainly be heavy. I don't know if I read this. Without the initial Christian doctrines giving Europeans free rein over the rest of the world, much of the exploitation would not have occurred. It was only when people were able to combine Western greed with religious fanaticism that the type and extent of exploitation that history has recorded was made possible. Even today, the Christian missionaries search the jungles of the Amazon looking for Indian tribes to convert. In their wake come the professional killers to exterminate the tribes, and following them, the government bureaucracies and road builders to subdue the lands of the interior for world commerce. And that's what they call progress. And almost let's just read that one sentence again. In their wake come the professional killers. All right, even today, Christianity missionaries search the jungles. So they send they're like canaries in coal mines trying to discover, right? Those tribes in the jungles. Where the CO2 is, by the way, as well. In their wake, in the wake of the church missionaries, the Christian missionaries, come the professional killers to exterminate the tribes, and following them, the government bureaucracies and road builders to subdue the lands of the interior for world commerce. You know, I don't think that there's any inability to demonstrate that these people are murderers. They are the professional killers. Organized crime, not to the point of just extortion for money, but literally professional killers. In almost every generation, trade and conversion for religious purposes have gone hand in hand to destroy nations of the world on behalf of Western commercial interests in Christianity. Where the cross goes, there is never life more abundantly, only death, destruction, and ultimately betrayal. As among all the nations of the world, the United States, because of its secular concern for justice, has created the best record in dealing with Aboriginal peoples. The checks and balances of the American political system have slowed the rate of exploitation of American Indians, so that for many tribes at least, a portion of legal status exists. The United States, for example, is the only nation to establish a claims commission to attempt to rectify treaty wrongs with the native inhabitants. Canada refuses to discuss such a commission. Australia loathes the suggestion. The average Christian, when hearing of the disasters wreaked on Aboriginal peoples by his religion and its adherents, is quick to state, but the people who did this were not really Christians. In point of fact, they really were Christians. In their day, they enjoyed all the benefits and prestige Christendom could confer. Real Christians do not. They were cheered as heroes of the faith, enduring hardships that a Christian society might be built on the ruins of pagan villages. Real Christians were not. They were featured in Sunday school lessons as saints of the Christian church. Real Christians were not. Cities, rivers, mountains, and seas were named after them. Real Christians were anonymous. And if the exploiters of old were not Christians, why did not the true Christians rise up in defiance of the derogation of their religious heritage of faith. Well, mainly because of misinformation. There's a lot of people, I believe, that stood up, and oppression, the same reason why you were not successful with all the numbers that you had in your tribes, I would have to say. If Pierre Trudeau is today not a Christian in his attitudes towards the Indians of Canada, where are the Christians in Canada who prophetically denounced his actions? If the leaders of the Brazilian government are not Christian, where are the Christians coming forth to disclaim their actions? They're in the artists and the writers who are oppressed. And we have to say, where are they in the intelligentsia is the question that you need to ask. Where are they in the intelligentsia? And they're there too. If exploitation of the Amazon for commercial purposes by American investors results in the unchristian activity of poisoning thousands of Indians, why are not the true Christians demanding the resignations of the heads of American corporations supporting Amazon development? At this point in the clash between Western industrialism and the planet's Aboriginal peoples, we find little or no voice coming from the true Christians to prevent continued exploitation. I mean, they call it Amazon. Instead, we find rhetorical assertions that the Christian God is controlling history and fulfilling his divine plan for all mankind. In the face of world events, this assertion is fraudulent at best, an insult to the intelligence of mankind at worst. It is time to call a halt to the unchallenged assumptions of the Christian conception of history. This conception is even breaking apart in the national strongholds of Christianity. The various tribal peoples of Europe that were bludgeoned into accepting supranationalism a century or more ago were flexing their muscles in resistance to continued oppression. In France, the Bretons have a national movement. The Flemish are receiving their ancient customs. Italy is a virtual conglomerate rebelling at the continued supremacy of the national government. Even Russia has problems of ethnic restlessness and the desire for freedom. Not only is Christian history at an end, but quite possibly the end is in sight for its secular manifest destiny of Europeans to rule the world. The first step in this process should not be recitals by sincere followers of the Christian religion of the Civil War. No, that's not what I said. Admitting their guilt for past wrongdoings. We have already seen a multitude of tears fall over the demise of D. Brown's Indians, for example, without a corresponding change in attitude or treatment of American Indians. Further confession of sins is useless and avoids the central question of history. Why must men repeat past mistakes? Being guilty for remote sins is easy. Accepting responsibility for current and future sins is difficult. That's why we recite them, in part, to have them out in public. Reciting them, you say they've accepted that, and not by laws or deeds. It is this contemporary attitude toward Aboriginal peoples that must be changed rather than compensation for past wrongs. Christians must disclaim the use of history as a weapon of conquest today. In doing so, they must support the fight of the Aboriginal peoples wherever it exists. They must demand a new status for Native peoples around the planet. They must demand protection of natives and their lands, cultures, and religions. They must honestly face the problems of the Western societies and consider what real alternatives now exist for these societies to survive in a world that is growing smaller. A world that must contain a great number of smaller groups whose existence is guaranteed and whose rights are not to be trampled underfoot. The justification of past exploitation of native peoples has been that the gospel has had to be preached to them and that a newer and better civilization had to rise from the native people's primitive hovels. Such a gospel of peace has been notoriously lacking as an element in Western civilization, and it is very questionable whether the present state of decay, corruption, and exploitation is better than what had existed before the coming of Western Christian to the nations of the world. When ecologists find a predictable lifespan of a generation separating us from total extinction, it would seem that we have a duty to search for another interpretation of mankind's life story instead of the traditional Christian view of the world and what it means. Unless we solve some of our problems, God will have to intervene to save any of us. The present state of affairs cannot conceivably be justified. It cannot be justified, at least religiously, and one must conclude that in Christianity, mankind has at best been deluded. While the religion appeared to give comfort and solace to people in all ages, its resultant impact on the world as a whole has been anything but comforting. It has been used by its followers to justify their most dastardly deeds, and it has focused our concern on the life hereafter, so that we have refused to believe what our experiences tell us is true. We must now undertake to find a more profound explanation of ourselves and the planet on which we live. Already in our secular society, we are finding indications that given a degree of concern for land, people, and solving problems, changes can be made in our understanding of the world. We now recognize that the command of Genesis is not to be taken literally. We simply cannot continue to be fruitful and multiply without destroying everything. We need some relevant form of birth control. In recent years, the legal status of abortion has been changed, and we are finally offered some relief from the medieval conception of women as breeding stock and society as a growing and expanding cancer on the land, which appears to have been the traditional Christian response to overpopulation problems forced upon us in defiance of reality as we have known it, which means we shouldn't have unwanted pregnancies. That's a reality. We have seen this past year the rejection of the death penalty by the Supreme Court and are now faced with the responsibility of acting as mature society in relation to those who defy our laws. While a substantial number of Christians supported abolition of the death penalty, an even greater number opposed abolition on biblical grounds. The fact that each justice of the Supreme Court felt it necessary to outline his own position on the subject indicates that we are not far over the threshold of barbarity. No sooner had the Supreme Court decision been announced than the nation's conservatives rose up to find ways to overcome the decision. In California, the referendum was placed on the ballot in 1972 and was passed into law. It required the death penalty on a mandatory basis for a specific list of crimes. Oh, I wonder where they were most prevalent, thereby making an effort to circumvent the reasoning of the justices, which we've seen over and over and over again. Which is Three Strikes You're Out, which was in the 1980s. In recent years, which was overturned, but it took a decade of people that were bound to a felony with a Three Strikes You're Out. In recent years, Congress has considered forms of compensation for victims of violent crimes. This development is a return to old Anglo-Saxon laws and finds its natural roots in the beliefs of tribal religions. The reward for suffering in Christianity has always been in heaven, and the idea that a society has a responsibility to compensate those whom it failed to adequately defend has not been a major thrust of Christian nations. Such a societal conception has always dominated Indian tribal groups. Beyond that, however, the idea of social compensation means that we have taken a major step in the conceptualization of America as a society with the potential for integrity. It is perhaps the most important aspect of the problem, whether or not you have integrity. We are now ridding ourselves of a fear of sex imposed upon us by Christian theologians of the past, beginning with the theology of St. Paul. Whether this society can complete the transition from thinking of sexual activity as inherently sinful to considering it as a normal part of the existence of a life species is yet a question to be resolved. At the very least, At the very least, the subject is brought out for consideration instead of being hidden in the closets of our minds. The rather lame efforts of Christian theologians to ride the crest of sexual freedom indicates that even for them, the matter is here to stay. And this is where liberals end up getting a bad name, I think, is in the sexual revolution that is associated with tribal religions and savagery by pagan religion, savagery by Christian religions who consider themselves to be much more civilized. But the idea of my liberal thinking is based in love, which is not sexual freedom. It is different. It is godly love. And you have godly love for the person that you decide to have a child with. And if you're having sexual pleasure with a person without having a child, you need to do that in the confines of a loving relationship. Otherwise, there is damage that will be done. And that's what I think. As a liberal thinker, that's what I think about sexuality. You have to, there was so much damage done. I was watching the documentary on Bowers. What was his first name? I don't remember. But, and this to me was the beginnings of the sex trafficking with Hollywood. And once again, seeing that we have to have laws made in order to keep people from breaking what is common knowledge regarding integrity and human respect, right? Okay. On almost every hand, therefore, we find the old mythologies of Christianity being intellectually and often emotionally rejected by contemporary society. The rejection is not always for the better. Jumping from Christianity to devil worship can hardly be called an improvement, but the willingness to explore the unknown forces in man's spiritual frontier can be called an improvement. And I don't understand what natives think of devil worship, right? What do they know, or what their knowledge is of devil worship, because they really keep away from it. And by the way, that is part of witchcraft. So to me, what it is part of a religion or way of thinking that calls in spirituality in order to call forth the demise of individuals. And that's what makes that evil, I think. We cannot reject the Christian religion piecemeal. You reject, all right, because you come from a perspective of never rejecting, not having to reject tribal religion piecemeal. The importance of the decline of the specific doctrines of the Christian religion is that the decline means that the whole religion has been wrong from its inception. Merely canceling the belief of the Christian afterlife does not free us from the necessity of finding out the nature of that life, if such exists. Rejecting the Christian interpretation, I feel like that's a bug there. Rejecting the Christian interpretation of creation means a responsibility to find a better conception of a religion as it relates to creation, or creation as it testifies to religion or religious experiences. And it's suggesting, Deloria is suggesting you can't. Having changed and rejected Christian interpretations of many of mankind's experiences, we must in our generation reject the concept of history as an inevitable and controlled or controllable process, our little adventure, right? Exactly. That there is something that I can do about this outcome. I'm happy I'm not suffering, right? It is part of God's plan. That's what he's saying. Our little adventure in Vietnam should surely testify to the fact that we cannot control history and that what appears inevitable is only a projection of our wishes, not a future event. We need to take a new look at what the experiences of mankind have been, and from our best conclusions begin to describe what we feel the whole nature and from our best conclusions. All right, I'll start that sentence over. We need to take a look at what experiences of mankind have been, and from our best conclusions begin to describe what we feel the whole nature of historical existence on the planet has meant. Stabilizing the societies of men so that further societal exploitation cannot exist is the first step in determining a new idea of history for mankind. And by the way, hasn't been that difficult to come by, the refusing to exploit people and live a different way. The planet was, and that is not of this world, right? That's how we are, not of this world. That human exploitation needs not be of this world. The planet was not given to the idea, the planet was not given to the Pope and his subsequent division of it to his favorite European kings. All right. The planet was not given to the Pope, and his subsequent divisions of it to his favorite European kings may have ultimately been illegal in the most fundamental sense of the term. Present unhampered exploitation of the lands and peoples of the world by post-Christian supernatural corporations may have been the logical result of Western history, but it does not have to be its final result. Christianity itself may find the strength to survive if it honestly faces the necessity to surrender its narrow interpretation of history and embark on a determined search for the true meaning of man's life on this planet. Even surrendering a belief in a God who exercises supremacy over world events becomes possible if in surrendering the belief one comes to a greater understanding of the nature of religion and religious experiences. For a divinity, if indeed one exists, cannot even be bound in doctrines and beliefs in any ultimate sense. To restrict one's God then to a particular mode of operation and sequence of appearance would seem to be irreligious and the utmost folly. That's it for chapter 15. We are here in the classroom, and we will have our last chapter of our book. God is red. He is mad as hell. God is red. He's not suggesting skin color, folks. He's not suggesting skin color. By Vinnie Deloria Jr. Last chapter. Get with it, folks. Watch. All right, this is Dr. Annette Feravich. We are here on the first day of July, back in the classroom with a real spirit, right? And beautiful flowers and a great background. And we've got these animals on their pedestals where they belong. The light's off the pedestals, I think. And I didn't make marks in the book, which I really want to go back and do. I hope I see you tomorrow in the early bird classroom, where, by the way, we're going to talk about what did you do on your 4 days off. I forgot to talk about that with the early birds. They have to be like, what? We'll get to it, early birds, tomorrow on Hump Day. Thanks for joining me here in the classroom.